This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair, OMFIF. Today, I have the great honor of being joined by Bo Lee, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, for this keynote session to kick off OMFIF's first Sustainable Policy Institute Symposium. Bo Lee recently joined the IMF from his role as Deputy Governor at the People's Bank of China, an institution in which he served for many years and was involved not only in the formulation of monetary policy, but banking sector reform, anti-money laundering legislation, and creating China's macroprudential framework. If that is not enough, Bo Lee was an attorney at the prestigious U.S. law firm of Davis Polk for several years and has a slew of degrees, including a PhD in economics from Stanford and a Harvard law degree. I understand that today's fireside chat with you represents your first public appearance as IMF Deputy Managing Director, and that makes it doubly, if not triply, an honor for OMFIF to host you today. So welcome to the IMF, welcome to OMFIF, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Well, great. In little more than a month, delegates from across the globe will meet for COP26. They will do so against the background of recent work showing that global temperatures will exceed pre-industrial levels by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius in coming decades, and by 3 degrees Celsius, if not more, by the end of the century, unless drastic action is taken. Hence, the Paris commitments may be beyond reach, and achieving net zero by 2050 will be impossible if there aren't massive national commitments to cut carbon emissions by 2030. I'm sure the IMF, like me, views these data points with alarm. Do you see COP26 as a defining moment? And what role will the IMF play at COP26?
Thank you, Mark. COP26 is surely a key milestone for the international community. Let's look at some recent events. The wildfire in North America and South Europe, the devastating flooding in Central Europe and in Asia, and the alarming melt of the permafrost in the Arctic. Once we saw these are far-off risks, but now they are near-term emergency. It is our sincere wish that at COP26, countries can come together with strong climate action. We see three policy priorities. The first is carbon pricing. The second is green investments. And the third is just transition. Let me go through this quickly one by one. In terms of carbon pricing, we see a robust carbon price as a key incentive for green transformation. Right now, the global average carbon price is $3 per ton. And if we want to achieve the goals set by the Paris Accord, that price has to go to $75 per ton by 2030. The second priority, we think, is green investments. We see a lot of opportunities in sectors such as renewables, low carbon mobility, energy efficiency, and new electricity networks. Our research shows that a combination of policies, including green investments and carbon pricing, will raise the global GDP by 2% in the next decade, create millions of jobs, at the same time solving our climate challenge. Now, in order to support such green investments, the financial sector also needs to work hard. The IMF is working with a number of international organizations and our members to promote green finance. And this include climate information architecture, such as data gaps, disclosure standards, and taxonomy. In addition to this foundational work, we're also working with international organizations and standard setters on stress tests for financial institutions in face of climate risk. In addition to that, a number of countries are experimenting with, in addition to fiscal policy incentive, a number of countries are experimenting with financial policy and even monetary policy incentives. And these are also very interesting experiments. And the third policy priority, we think, is a just transition that will be inclusive and equitable. Within countries, we see some vulnerable groups, households, workers, may be hurt by green transition, by climate policy. And there should be compensation for the negatively affected groups and regions. In addition to that, if we look across countries, a lot of developing countries have huge mitigation and adaptation needs, and they have very little fiscal space. And there is a $100 billion per year climate finance commitment from advanced economies. And we hope advanced economies can meet or even exceed this commitment. In addition to financial support, technology transfer is also important to developing economies. So if I want to sum up, the world is facing tremendous challenge in climate. And we sincerely wish or hope that COP26 can move us significantly further along the direction set in the Paris Accord. And the IMF has stepped up our work on climate, and we are here to support our members and the international community.
Fantastic. You've given us a lot to dig in on in a brief period of time. In talking about carbon pricing, obviously the fund is a very technocratic, neutral organization. You spend a lot of time working on creating appropriate economic incentives and sound fiscal policies. Relative prices are key for incentives, and fiscal measures can be used to impact pricing and address externalities, as you said. You mentioned the $75 a ton 2030 global carbon price as critical for tackling climate change. The fund has also recently proposed a very pragmatically an international carbon price floor for big emitters. Can you tell us a little bit more about the fund's work on carbon pricing?
We think that a robust carbon price is the most effective incentive for decarbonization. Our research shows that if we want to achieve the goal set by the Paris Accord to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, we need to cut the carbon emission, the global carbon emission, by a quarter to a half. And this is unlikely to be achieved unless carbon price can rise to $75 per ton by 2030. The international community has made some progress in this regard. We see more than 60 countries or subnationals have introduced some kind of carbon pricing scheme. However, there is still a long way to go. 4/5 of the global carbon emission are still unpriced. And right now, as I mentioned, the global carbon price is at $3 per ton. far from the 2030 target of $75 per ton. Given this situation, we think stronger and more coordinated action are needed to achieve a robust carbon price. Our staff has published a paper recently on international carbon price floor. And this proposal is still under discussion with our executive board and our members. I want to briefly introduce that proposal here. There are primarily three features to that proposal. The first feature is a focus on a small number of big emitters, basically some or all G20 members. So it will be easier to negotiate and coordinate. At the same time, cover an overwhelming majority of the emission in this world. The second feature of this proposal is to focus on a single minimum carbon price for each country. And our staff regard that as a more effective and more credible way to coordinate the global decarbonization efforts. And the third feature of this proposal is that our staff support a differentiated responsibility among different countries. And this principle is also incorporated in the Paris Accord. So countries will have a carbon price based on their development level and their historical emission. And in our staff paper, we use an illustrative example of $25, $50, and $75 among 6 major emitters, including US, UK, Europe, India, Canada, and China. And in that example, it is a price floor. So some countries can actually commit more. And some countries do commit more than this $25, $50, and $70 price floor. And in that example, if these 6 countries achieve that price by 2030, we can achieve a carbon reduction of 23% by 2030. And that is consistent with the 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so in conclusion, this example we just gave, this 25, 50, 70 is just an illustration. And the actual result will very much up to the negotiation among major emitters. But what we can see here is that we think this approach, this international carbon price floor approach, is better than some proposed other alternatives, such as border carbon adjustment. And we are concerned that border carbon adjustment could create some trade protectionism, could also be divisive, and could only target a small subset of the products that we want to cover. A uniform price based on international carbon price floor will cover a much wider range of products and also much less divisive. This, of course, requires political will. And I think many countries already showed strong political will under the Paris Accord. And we regard this international carbon price floor as an effective way to channel the already existing political will to a more productive and effective coordination mechanism. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you for that. So what you mentioned at the beginning, also a just transition. I think a key question is how to make carbon pricing acceptable to the publics. My country, there hasn't been able to raise the federal gas tax. Senators oppose shrinking the coal sector. We don't have a federal carbon price. We saw the Gilets jaunes in France. Do you think that using the proceeds of a carbon tax can play a role in helping build support. And coming back to another thing that you said at the beginning, you mentioned this goal of major countries providing 100 billion per year for developing countries to support climate adaptation and mitigation. I mean, how does the IMF see that commitment? I mean, is it being fulfilled? Is it short? And what can you do to encourage progress if it's falling short?
Thank you for that question, Mark. We think the wise use of tax proceeds can play a huge role in garnering public support for climate initiatives. We take a pragmatic approach in terms of how to achieve a robust carbon price. Some countries might want to use a carbon tax. Some countries might want to use an emission trading system. And in some other countries, a regulatory approach may be adopted. We think whatever works, given the urgency and the magnitude of the challenge, we support all potential approaches. We also think that economic logic may not always go along with political logic. Economically, we certainly prefer a market-based instrument such as carbon tax or emission trading system. But we also understand politically, in some cases, a regulatory approach may be preferred. And we will not let the perfect to be an obstacle to the good. However, regardless which approach a country takes, we think public support is always important. If a country adopts carbon tax, it is important to use the tax proceeds wisely. And we support the use to support green investments or to reduce other more distortionary tax, such as labor tax. And more importantly, such proceeds can be used to compensate those who are adversely affected by the climate policy, those households, those workers, and those regions. And the proceeds of the tax revenue can be used to do cash transfer, to beef up the social safety network, to retrain workers, or to relocate affected households. All these uses we think are important, both for equitable purposes, but also to gather public support. And if a country uses the ETS, emission trading system, and these things have to be designed properly, and if they are designed properly, they can achieve equivalent outcome in terms of revenue and also social spending. So last year, in our World Economic Outlook, our flagship publication, there is a chapter which proposed that if we can have a properly designed policy package of carbon pricing, green investments, and just transition, we can achieve a triple win. That is, we can address the climate challenge, we can create jobs and growth, and we can create just transition. And that last element, just transition, is very important to gather public support. And Mark, to answer your follow-up question on the $100 billion commitment from advanced economies, we think that's a critical part of the Paris Accord. And we urge advanced economies to meet or exceed that commitment. We see developing countries have huge needs for adaptation, and there is very limited fiscal space. So financial support from advanced economies are very important, both for equitable purposes and also for development purposes. We have to remember that many of the developing countries, they were historically not big emitters. So this $100 billion commitment is very important to gather public support in the developing economies. In addition, this support is not a charity, because we see a lot of low-cost mitigation opportunities also in developing economies. Climate challenge is really a global challenge, and it is in everybody's interest to fulfill this $100 billion financial support every year. In addition to financial support, as I mentioned before, we think technology transfer and sharing are also important to help developing countries to catch up on climate technology. Thank you, Mark.
Well, before we turn to the IMF and a more institutional nitty-gritty questions in the remaining time, just a quick comment. If the average global carbon price is $3 and you're saying 75 is what's needed, and we're seeing public backlashes against using the proceeds and whatnot, I wonder if I'm being too fearful in thinking that perhaps we're losing the race against time.
Well, Mark, I want to share a recent working paper by our IMF staff to show that there is still real hope if we work together. This paper is on fossil fuel subsidies. I know you personally worked on fossil fuel subsidies before under the G20 framework. So the science is very clear. Without a dramatic decline in fossil fuel consumption, we're going to see continued destruction to our planet and to our people's health. And this 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by the Paris Accord will remain out of reach. In addition, the economics is also very clear. If we want to have a serious decarbonization movement, we need to get the price right. And this price should reflect not only the supply costs of fossil fuel, but also the environmental costs of fossil fuel. Underpriced fossil fuel create many wrongs. It undermines domestic and international climate objective. It hurts people and our planet. It is often badly targeted, often benefits higher income people more than poor people. And it also undermines, it also deprives governments of precious fiscal resource. And this paper published last week by our staff shows that in 2020 alone, last year alone, the total subsidies for fossil fuel globally amount to $6 trillion. That's 6.8% of global GDP. And 70% of that subsidy reflect the undercharge for environmental costs. The good news is that if we work together to remove subsidies on fossil fuel by 2025, we're going to see a reduction of 1/3 in global carbon emission. That is fully consistent with 1.5 degree target set by the Paris Accord. In addition, 1 million deaths caused by air pollution can be avoided every year. And also, governments around the world can gather additional tax revenue, additional fiscal revenue of 4% of global GDP.
Well, I have to say, I'm glad you're hopeful. I remember negotiating in 2009 G20 communique language to end fossil fuel subsidies, and I think the language is still there, but maybe you'll have better luck than I did. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I have a massive question for you. But the fund is known. It has three broad functions: technical assistance, surveillance, and programs. I understand the board has been discussing how the fund could intensify its work on climate change in each of these areas. What can you tell us about the IMF's operational work in these areas to give the public a better sense of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, we are putting climate at the heart of our work, from surveillance to capacity building to lending programs. In surveillance, under Article 4 consultations, we have incorporated mitigation policies in our Article 4 consultation for top 20 emitters in this world. We're also incorporating adaptation policies for those vulnerable countries. We're also incorporating transition policies into all economies, especially those economies heavily dependent on fossil fuel production. In our FSAP, our Financial System Assessment Program, we are incorporating physical risk and transition risk into our assessment of financial sector stability. In addition, we are working with UN and the World Bank and other international organizations to produce climate change indicators dashboard as a surveillance tool. In terms of capacity development, we are helping a number of countries to develop frameworks supporting green budgeting and green investments. We are also developing our CMAP, that's Climate Macroeconomic Assessment Program, which will help countries to integrate climate into every aspect of macro fiscal policy. In terms of our lending program, in connection with this $650 billion SDR allocation we just completed, we are exploring the creation of a new trust called Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which will support long-term structural transformation by our members. In addition, we are discussing the possibility of debt for climate swaps with a number of partners and stakeholders. In addition to those traditional areas of work, we are also working with a number of international organizations on the foundational work for climate policy and green finance. We are co-hosting the Secretariat of Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. We are working with a number of international organizations on climate information architecture, as I mentioned before, including data gaps and disclosure standards. So we're doing a lot, and we're doing that in a way that is consistent with our mandate, that is to look at macro critical issues that will affect financial and economic stability of our members. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you. We've run out of time, but I have to thank you once again very profusely for joining us today. You've given us a wonderful outline of what the fund is doing on climate policy, and that's a tall order already, and that's before one factors in all the other things that the IMF does in its daily life. So you have a very busy new job and a lot of work ahead of you. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Washington.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Looking forward to meeting you in person.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.